What if I told you that the most powerful religion of the Western world started out by meeting underground in tunnels surrounded by the dead? Intrigued? Welcome back to You, Me, and Art. I'm your host, More Arneche, and I am so excited for today's episode. Now, before we begin, I wanted to explain a small change in the way that I'll be approaching this season. So as we continue through all 250 of the AP Art History works, I'm shifting to a new format that makes each episode easier to follow along and to learn from. It's going to be more review style. So if you're an AP Art History student, you've already got that solid foundation from your class, and this is a way to remember those core ideas. And if you're someone who just wants to learn about art, which is amazing as well, you can really grasp the big picture of these artworks. So for each artwork, we're going to be answering three main questions. Why was it made? What should we notice? And why does it matter? And at the end of each piece, I'll give you one quick sentence to really remember this artwork and help it stick. So if you're a student, you can really go back to that one line and remember it if you're on the AP exam or for a test. So that being said, let's continue our journey throughout AP Art History, one artwork at a time, starting into Content Area 3, Early Europe and Colonial Americas. All right, picture Rome in the 2nd century. Christianity is still illegal, and its followers have nowhere public to gather or bury their dead. So they go underground, and they dig miles of tunnels outside the city walls, lining the walls with burial niches stacked like shelves. And down there in the dark, small communities, they would gather to mourn, to pray, and to remember the martyrs. Now, Christianity doesn't have this established iconography that is really recognizable today. So they borrow symbols from different cultures and they also invent their own. This is where it's all starting. It's so cool. And the most famous image that is found in the catacomb of Priscilla is the Good Shepherd. So in this image, Christ isn't shown as a king or as a judge like he often is today, but he's actually a man carrying a lamb on his shoulders and protecting that lamb. And it's super simple. That was the point. They really wanted to just convey the idea. And they also couldn't give much away, that fact that they were Christian, because they would get persecuted. So this is really important because it's the beginning of Christian iconography. And it really tells us a lot about where the religion was at the time and what their core beliefs are. So when you're remembering this artwork, remember it as the underground beginnings of Christian identity. We're fast forwarding 2 centuries, and Christianity is no longer a crime. It's the religion of the empire. So it's a really big shift for this religion. So now that they're able to be seen in the public, they have to decide, what do Christian buildings even look like? So this is the beginning of that. And Santa Sabina, which is built in Rome in the 5th century, gives us an answer of what a Christian building looks like. And it's very practical, actually. So actually, instead of inventing something entirely new, the builders looked for something that was already existing, a shape that Rome really knew well, which is the basilica. If you remember the form of Trajan, the Basilica Oppia, so it's something that really comes up a lot. And so they used it here again. Basilicas are long rectangular halls that Romans used for law, for courts, for public business. Now they're stripping out the governmental function and they're adding an altar at one end. Perfect use for a Christian church because the crowd's attention in this hall is all being pulled forward to the altar, and all the attention is on the sacred. Now it's really simple compared to what we see later on in Christian churches, and we'll be covering that. But for now, it's very simple and very direct, which is important because Christianity is really finding its footing. So they're focused on the core beliefs and teaching. So when you're remembering this artwork, remember it as Roman architecture transformed into a Christian gathering space. Okay, imagine you're very wealthy and you're in the Byzantine world and you want a Bible. But you don't want just any Bible because you're very wealthy. So someone creates this fancy Bible for you, and they dye the parchment a really rich purple, which is very expensive and reserved for emperors, by the way. So you must be very wealthy if this is your Bible. And the person making this Bible for you writes the book of Genesis all across it in silver ink, because not just any ink will do. Well, the Vienna Genesis has just been made for you. Using storytelling tricks borrowed straight from Roman tradition, the Vienna Genesis shows figures in motion and scenes unfolding across the page. So it's really illustrating Christian ideas and stories. Not only does this make it really engaging for anyone who's reading this text, but also the pictures helped for anyone who couldn't read, they could understand the story. Okay, there are two distinct pages that we're going to focus on. The main thing to remember for each of them is what I'm going to cover. So for the first page, Jacob wrestling the angel, really remember that in what you can see in the image is that it's not about realism. It's about the intensity. It's about the struggle. And that's the key theme in the story. So that's what's coming across in the image. And then for Rebecca and Eliezer at the well, there are a lot of moments in the story, and they're all in one single image, which is really cool because it shows how the artist really wanted to focus on having a clear narrative. Like they just wanted to make sure you could understand what was happening. And so they chose one big main image instead of showing a lot of stories, which it can be easy to lose track of the main theme. And so the artist is really kind of putting all these images together, and it's more focused on the story and the narrative rather than making everything visually in space correct. So this book as a whole is both scripture, but it's also a status symbol because, like I said before, if this was your book, you would have been very, very wealthy. So when remembering this artwork, I leave you with this. It is a luxury manuscript that turns biblical stories into lasting experiences. In Ravenna, Emperor Justinian commissions a church. But really, what he wants is to make a very big statement, and he wants everyone to know it. San Vitale breaks from the long basilica shape that we touched on in Santa Sabina. And instead, it's an octagon, which is like the centralized space. And so it's less of a hall, and it looks kind of like a jewel box because of the shape. And really, it kind of looks like a jewel because there's so many tiny pieces of glass and stone, and it's all set against a gold background. So the walls are completely covered in mosaic, and they glow, which is so, so neat. The most famous panels are the ones that show Justinian and his wife, Theodora. And they're each surrounded by their courts. But if you really look closely, you'll notice once again, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but truly it's an important part of Christian iconography at the time and Byzantine art, is that it was not realistic at all. Instead, the faces are very stiff and the eyes are fixed forward. And that is really recognizable for Byzantine art. When you see art that looks like this, most likely it's going to be Byzantine art. And so if you're ever at an art museum and you see something that looks like that, you can be like, that's Byzantine art. And you will sound so smart. You can impress all your friends. Okay, but the reason for that stiffness and the fact that it wasn't realistic was because Byzantine art was trying not to capture what the face looked like, but it was actually focusing on the fact of the argument that these rulers were chosen by God. That's really shown by the gold. That's what that is supposed to communicate. These leaders were divinely chosen. So Justinian commissioned a portrait that made him and his wife look divinely chosen. Very subtle flex. So the Theodora mosaic in particular is worth zooming in on. She's dressed all in jewels and she's flanked by her clergy, but she isn't just depicted as Justinian's wife. She's actually the main character, which is awesome. So when you remember this artwork, you can remember it as a church where architecture and mosaics are used to show religion, but also power. Okay, but Justinian, he isn't done. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. In Constantinople, he commissions something that is supposed to outdo every single building that came before it, the Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia actually means holy wisdom. The entire challenge for this building, which hadn't been figured out yet, was how do you rest a circular dome on top of a square building without it collapsing? And now it's done all the time, but before then, no one knew how to do it. So 2 architects, I'll put their names here and here because I do not want to butcher their names, but they solve it. They do that using pendentives, which are curved triangular sections that transfer the dome's weight down into the corners so it doesn't collapse. And then they ring the base of the dome with windows. And so by doing so, the dome seems to have no support at all. It looks like it's floating. It looks like it's being held up by light because of the windows instead of actually being held up by stone. When you're walking in, the effect that creates is the visitors feel like they're walking into heaven itself, kind of in a way. And so the mosaics inside really reinforce that feeling, and it creates that energy. The Theotokos mosaic shows Mary enthroned with the infant Christ. It's very formal, and it's remote against gold. And another mosaic called this, the Diesis mosaic, which is added later, shows Christ flanked by Mary and John the Baptist, pleading on humanity's behalf. And here the faces soften, and so there's a little bit more emotion than earlier Byzantine work allowed. So this building has a lot of history to it and a lot of different purposes. In 1453, the Ottomans take Constantinople, and Hagia Sophia then becomes a mosque. So minarets go up outside, which are part of Islamic architecture. And there's also calligraphy on panels, which are up inside, and they cover the mosaics, but the mosaics are not destroyed. They're still there. They're layered over instead. So this building has a record of 2 empires. And so you can visit this in what is today in Istanbul. And it's actually on my bucket list. I really do want to visit this artwork. Honestly, I want to visit all the artworks in APR history. Okay, so when you're remembering Hagia Sophia, remember it as the Byzantine masterpiece that's dome made it feel like heaven. Not every powerful object is a building. After Rome falls, the Merovingians, which are a Germanic dynasty ruling parts of France, they're pinning their cloaks shut with brooches called fibulae. And functionally, they're clothing fasteners, but you look a little closer and you realize they're covered in gemstones, enamel, and interlocking animal shapes. So they were clearly meant to be seen and admired. So if you wear a pair of fibulae, it was practical, like I said, but it actually told everyone in Europe who you were and what you were worth. So in a Europe that has lost the Roman Empire and that unifying empire, these small objects started really transforming the culture and carrying a new cultural idea that blends Roman craftsmanship that was in the empire, but now Germanic design. So if you're going to remember this artwork as small jewelry that reveals a changing Europe after Rome. This is a Byzantine icon. Believers thought that icons like these created an actual connection between the viewer and the figures shown. Mary sits very rigid and frontal, and Christ is in her lap, flanked by 2 saints standing guard on either side. Again, nothing here is trying to look real. The gold background is seen again, so it's Byzantine art. And the gold also is what really reinforces that otherworldly divine presence. And the icon also sits right in the middle of one of Byzantium's biggest controversies, which is iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is a period where the empire actually debated and oftentimes also banned the use of religious images altogether. So the fact that this icon survives tells us how deeply important images like these were to the Byzantine faith, because it wasn't destroyed. It was saved. So remember it first and foremost as a Byzantine icon that connects people with the divine. On a remote island monastery in Northumbria, monks spent years hand-copying the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Monasteries like these ones were the hub of the early medieval world. They were centers where knowledge and religion and art were all together. What we find as a result are these intricate carpet pages. They're so dense and specific because they were supposed to be meditated on before the reader actually reaches any of the actual text. And this was supposed to be done alongside portrait pages, which are honoring each of the gospel writers. This style specifically mixes Celtic knotwork, Germanic animal patterns, and Mediterranean religious imagery. So all of this mix shows that even though you're not kind of in that center of Europe where all of these countries and cultures are colliding, it's still happening even on the outskirts, which is really cool. I love that. So remembering this artwork as a manuscript where Christianity meets Celtic and Germanic design. Now we're crossing into Islamic Spain, where Córdoba has become one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe under the Umayyad dynasty. Here we have a mosque, which reflects that ambition of a sophisticated city. Okay, so if you walk inside, you see rows and rows and rows and rows of red and white horseshoe arches, which are all across columns in hundreds of directions, all around. There's no actual single focal point to look at, which is done on purpose. You'll notice a lot of things are done on purpose in art history. And this purpose is to pull the visitor towards reflection rather than looking at one image or altar. It's supposed to be endless. You're not really supposed to be focused on one thing. You're supposed to be kind of going within and reflecting. Gosh, I love art. It's so cool. I love how intentional it is. Okay, just got to geek out a little bit. Also, this building is shaped by a lot of cultural exchanges. Islamic, Christian, Jewish, all these communities which are living in Spain have influence on this artwork, which is important as well. And it's really that cultural blend of different communities, and it's meant for that reflection and connection to the spiritual world. So remember it as a forest of arches which represent the power of Islamic Spain. Like the fibulae that I touched on earlier, not every important object in Islamic Spain is massive, which is great. This small ivory container was carved for a member of the Umayyad royal family, which is that same royal family that is associated with the last artwork. And this artwork is small enough to hold in one hand, but all around it, it's covered in tiny carved scenes of animals and plants and figures which are connected to power and abundance. All right, surprise, surprise. The size has a purpose. Everything has a purpose. What the artists were thinking when they made this artwork is that anything can be big and say we're powerful, right? But it has to take a lot of skill and a lot of craftsmanship to be able to convey power on something so small. That shows true skill and true craftsmanship, and that's what this was all about. So remember it as a tiny ivory box that is mighty and shows royal power. All right, and that's it. Today, we moved from the rise of Christianity in Rome through Byzantine art and to the growth of Islamic Spain. Artists throughout all different kinds of cultures and locations have used images and architecture to express faith, to express power, and to preserve their culture. At the end of the day, I will leave you with the big idea that if you look closely enough, art always tells a story. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Let me know if you liked this new format, a little bit more laid back and more of a review style. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time as we continue our journey throughout APUR history, one artwork at a time. I'm Moira Arcebarneche, and this has been You, Me, and Art. I'll see you next time.